Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this presentation. My name is Michelle Diaz. I'm the Education Program Manager at Trees Atlanta. And our mission is to protect and improve Atlanta's urban forests by planting, conservation, and education. We host programs like these year-round, so we invite you to check out our website and visit our calendar for more information. Today, you're going to be able to ask questions through the Q&A tool and through the chat. I'll be your moderator. If you have any questions, please send them through the chat or the Q&A, and the speakers will be answering them live at the end of the presentation. After this event, you're going to be receiving a survey email. We'll love your feedback to hear from you what you think about the program, if you have any other ideas of programs that we could be bringing to our community. And to learn more about upcoming events, sign up for our newsletter and check out us on social media. Our speakers today are Peter Essick, who's the author of the book we're going to be talking today, and Eli Dickerson, who's the ecologist at Fernbank Museum of Natural History. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Peter and Eli, for joining us.
Thanks, Michelle.
Yeah, Peter, you can go ahead and start your presentation. Thank you, Peter, for joining.
Thank you, Michelle. Okay, well, first I'd like to thank Trees Atlanta for hosting this event. I'm going to be talking about a project that I did about Fernbank Forest, Atlanta's unique old growth forest. It started with a commission that I got from the Fernbank Museum to document the forest during a period of transition where they were doing a lot of restoration work. And then it ended up with this sort of a coffee table book that was published by Fall Line Press, which is an Atlanta fine art photo book publisher. So Fernbank Forest is this 65 acres of old growth forest. And as you can see, it's not far from the skyline of Atlanta. And it's very unique in that it's in the Piedmont Forest, which is the foothills of the Appalachians, and it's known as really one of the best examples of an old growth urban forest in the whole Piedmont region, which goes all the way along the East Coast from, I believe it's Alabama, all the way up to New Jersey. So the reason that Fernbank Forest exists is the work of a woman named Emily Harrison. And her father, C.D. Harrison, was the clerk of the Georgia Supreme Court. And in 1889, they moved to this homestead, which at the time was 4 miles outside of downtown Atlanta. And this is now the site of where Fernbank Forest is. And the homestead the house is no longer there, and there's some trees that have grown back, but the site is still part of the current Fernbank Forest. And this was the driveway that goes up, and you can see you're looking down on what is now the Druid Hills Golf Course. And they made a little artificial pond. There's a small creek that goes through Fernbank, and it's now called Huntman Pond. So there's just some of the historic pictures. So when I was first approached to do this project was in 2015, and you can see there's a lot of beautiful old trees, but there was a lot of invasive species, and the main one was this English ivy. And that was the project that Eli is going to be talking about after my presentation, a lot about how we went about to do the restoration to try and eliminate a lot of these invasive species. But by the time I finished, within a year to 2 years, you can see there's a very big difference. In this picture, there really isn't even any invasive species left. This is kind of the forest with all its glory as far as in the native species with the invasives removed. So it was kind of a challenge at first to how to photograph Fernbank. You can see there's these paths that go through, and you're under the canopy. So the tree on the left is a short-leaf pine that's over 130 feet tall. So this picture is actually a stitching of 52 pictures together. It's like a 180-degree view to try and get a feeling of kind of being inside the forest, but then looking up at this canopy above you. There's kind of the understory and then the overstory. Fernbank, this is named for the ferns that were lining the north-facing bank that goes through the topography of the forest. And it's because you have cool temperatures in the north-facing bank, you have some really rare species in the forest. And these are called silvery glade ferns. I believe there's many other different species of fernbank, of ferns that give the fernbank its name. So as part of this project, I learned to fly a drone, and I wanted to see what it was like to get some pictures above the forest. There's a lot of the you know, the visuals, you're sort of down inside. So this is during that period, what they call the leaf out, which for about a week to 2 weeks in the spring, where the leaves start coming out, but you can sort of still see through all the way to the forest floor. And this is in the springtime, everything is sort of bright yellow green. And it's a little bit of a challenge, I think, to photograph some of the wildlife for mink, but there is quite a bit. There's this was a barred owl that was nests in the forest, and the eastern bluebirds, the songbirds, and the blue jays. These have to have a very long lens. There's actually up kind of high in the forest there, but it is a Audubon sanctuary site for a lot of the birds in Fernbank. And this is the pond. A lot of the wildlife comes in around that area. Said before, it's actually they put a little dam in the little stream and made an artificial pond. And I did, as part of the project, I did 3 of these with collages, where I kind of put 16 different pictures, sort of a little bit different times, but this one was sort of to show the different views of the Huntman Pond. And this is actually during the start of the fall, when the leaves start falling off into the pond. And another view through the trees and the reflections. And this was surprised to see this, but it's actually a North American freshwater river otter. and it comes and goes. There's actually a culvert that goes through out of Fernbank and into over to the little stream that goes through the golf course, and so they can kind of come and go. This is a green frog. Anytime you have amphibian life, you know that you have so good water quality, and especially you have salamanders. This is a two-line salamander. There's a group from the museum that once a month they do an inventory of the amphibians, the frogs and salamanders, and it actually is a very good water quality in the small little stream that goes through the forest. So as part of the book, we wanted to also include a small guidebook. This is like a little 4 by 6 inch book that goes into a pocket in the back. And Eli really helped us with this. He kind of picked out some of the favorite places to visit, and then we had an illustrator do the lines. So you can see there's a champion eastern hemlock, and then this elephant rock, and then I think a little bit about the creek cascades and the salamanders. And this is a picture. This is actually taken with a drone of that champion eastern hemlock, the largest of its species within Atlanta, within 285 inside the. And these are umbrella magnolias. And this is Elephant Rock. This is one of the big landmarks that Emily Harrison spoke about. You can see that with the creek, it's a very small little creek. But what's unique about it also is that the whole watershed is within the Fernbank Forest. Canopy of the beech leaves. And there's a real old tulip poplar that has these resurrection ferns, and it's kind of hard to see them, but with the drone you can look down, and especially during the winter time they really stand out. There's another shot of the young trees from a drone. Learning more and more about the fungus and how fungus is used for the trees. You can use fungus to communicate to the roots, and then where it pops up, the sort of turkey tail fungus that you can see above ground. But below ground, there's a lot of fungus in an old growth forest. And these are ginger flowers. These are also just right below the surface. Eli helped me with this one. He just sort of scraped away a little bit of the soil, and I'm surprised to see these just almost. Tulip tree flowers. Tulip poplar is probably one of the most common trees in Fernbank. And trout lily. There's at least 35 native wildflowers. I think probably found a few more every year, but there's one section of the rain lilies that came up, and it's it's really amazing how each week there's a whole, during the spring, there's just a whole different flowering bloom calendar, so to speak. Yeah, this is another one, sort of a collage of 16 the different wildflowers. Won't name them all, but you can see there's quite a variety. They start with the bloodroots, probably the first one in late February, and then kind of go through the spring, and then if there's a few late blooming ones in the summer. Again, the fall is a special time with the colors. It's actually this latitude now, it's probably in mid-November. That's another one from the drone looking down on the Huntman Pond, some of the foliage, fall foliage, and sort of the peak fall foliage. And winter is kind of a unique time. It's probably not as many people visit, but it's another one, sort of a collage of looking up at the the sunrise, sunlight hitting on the top, and then the sort of the bare trees with you can see some of the beech trees are the ones that keep their leaves. So, and this doesn't happen too often anymore in Atlanta, but it did. There was one day where it snowed a couple inches. So this is actually a picture from the drone. And of course, by the afternoon, it pretty much all melted away. Yeah. You do get some periods of ice still in Atlanta, and this was a part of the Huntman Pond. And looking down with the drone again, you can see the kind of mostly the bare trees, and then you have the beech. You can see some of the beech trees that still have their leaves, and then a few, if you look real close, you can see a little bit of possibly some of the green, some of the possibly there's probably the ivy that probably hasn't been removed yet. There's not much green that's native, maybe those resurrection ferns. And that's another angle drone of the beech trees. Beech leaves. Here's some ice again. Got that a few times during the two winters. Probably anybody who lives in Atlanta knows that the ice can cause a lot of havoc with all the traffic and everything, but it can be kind of a beautiful, because it outlines all the bare branches. And another winter ice with the beech tree. And this is another one of my collages, 16 pictures looking up. There's some areas, it's pretty amazing. It's just filled with the beech leaves, right in the dead of winter. Beech leaf. This is when you do a book, you can put in some aspects of the forest that maybe pictures you wouldn't put on your wall, but this is a pileated woodpecker that was victim of a predator. I don't know exactly what the whole story was here. In the winter, it's some interesting sunsets looking out to the east, kind of the pink glow of winter. And then finally, this picture was special to me. This is the blood roots. It was taken on February 28th, and there was an area that had been covered in a lot of the English ivy. And when they cleared it off, you could see a lot of these blood roots started coming up in this one area. It's hard to know how long those seeds had been kind of covered. They probably couldn't come up through a blanket of the English ivy, but these native species were able to come back again after the restoration. And this is kind of what something that I think is important. You can see the glow of the city coming into Fernbank, and even though it's a beautiful and old growth forests, even it's still affected by the city, what's next to it, and especially invasive species that can, seeds that can blow in and things. So last, for anybody who is interested in the book, I talked to Fall Line Press, is the publisher. They're here in Atlanta, and they were able, you could, if you use this code here, which is called trees ATL 20, first you go to falllinepress.com, which is their website. If you can order the book, and you'll get 20% off for the next few days. If you just use this code, trees ATL. So thank you very much, and I think I'll turn it back to Michelle and Eli. So, let's see.
Thanks, Peter. That was amazing. My pictures are not going to look quite as good as Peter's, but I will get into some of the technical aspects of the ecological restoration. Not too technical, but I want to cover some of the details, and definitely want to take questions both for Peter and myself at the end. So bear with me. I did a Prezi, so it's an online cloud-based presentation. So some of the transitions might not be quite as smooth as a regular slideshow. I'm going to try to pull that up now. Let's see. Okay. So this is a presentation I originally presented at the Cullowhee Native Plant Conference that some of you may have heard of or may have attended. And I made some modifications because we've had some updates since this was last presented, and added some new pictures and information and whatnot. But I kind of like the format of the Prezi, so I wanted to stick with that. So Saving an Old Growth Forest is the title. And in 2015, I was hired and really had a somewhat of a daunting task ahead of me, and that was to lead the ecological restoration effort in Fernbank Forest and really hit the ground running. So I consider it an honor. I consider it a privilege, but it was scary too. This is a very unique forest in terms of what we have in Atlanta, and there's a lot worth protecting. And I really wanted to, as much as possible, do this the right way. So this presentation will discuss 5+ years of what we've been doing in Fernbank Forest and the efforts that I have led through Fernbank Museum. If I can get it to go. All right, sorry folks, bear with me for a second here. Oops, too far ahead there. There we go. Okay, so what exactly is Fernbank Forest? Well, first I want to absolutely start this presentation with a land acknowledgement. This is Muskogee Creek land traditionally, historically. So we talk sometimes about the history, the human history in the area, And while the more recent history is certainly worth discussing, there's tens of thousands of years of native history in this land. So I would be remiss if I did not mention that this is Muskogee Creek land. And that is something that we are working on incorporating in our educational programming at Fernbank as well. So it's a forest in a city. And you can tell here, you know, we're surrounded by 5 million plus people. So though it's not right downtown, it is literally surrounded by over 5 million people. So this is truly a city in a forest. This is our campus, and it is, you can see spread out. There's some residential lots that were acquired over the years. Fernbank Forest is in the upper right-hand corner, and that's about 65 acres. In addition to that, we actually own Deep Dean Park, and this is managed through a collaborative effort with the Olmsted Linear Park Alliance and also DeKalb County Parks. Also another wonderful park, green space, 22 acres, worth visiting if you have not been there. And the museum is in the lower left-hand corner here. So here's a map of the forest. This topographical map is very useful. I use it with staff and contractors, volunteers, researchers all the time. But the lowest point in the forest is right down here where Peter mentioned there being a culvert that some of the animals like the river otters can get through. So this is the west end of the forest, is the lowest end. And that's where Fernbank Creek flows into Druid Hills Golf Course. The highest end is in the upper right-hand corner, northeast corner. And there's about 130 feet of vertical difference between the low point and the high point in the forest. That's at ground level. So not including the tree heights. But it's quite steep. And a lot of our guests are surprised when they walk the trails and the paths and they realize that it is far steeper than the average neighborhood street around here. And I think that topography may have played into why it was protected. So when I started in my role in 2015, one of my first tasks, one of the first things that I chose to do was let's set up management zones in the forest and number those. And I decided to do that on a watershed model. So what that means is if you cross a creek or even a dry ephemeral stream, you're crossing into a different management zone. And that zone is bound by any kind of physical permanent structure like a path or a fence, property line, something like that. So while it may look like kind of a mishmash of different size areas that don't really make sense, when I have researchers or contractors on the ground, they know when they cross a swale in the forest, they are moving into a different management area. So that's immensely helpful, and it prevents us from having to, you know, put up flagging tape or something like that. So these zones are used for invasive species control, research, any reason we may need to outline certain areas in the forest. And we name the paths as well. So I'm going to run some numbers by you guys, and Peter mentioned some of this. So the forest is about 65 acres. There's 1.7 miles of paved paths in the forest. So that is, people often ask, you know, how long does it take to do the trails? How long are the trails? Well, it's a number of interlooping paths. So you can't really do every trail once. You kind of have to do these figure eights and loops. So if you do all 1.7 miles, you actually end up doing about 2 or 3 miles total. Our campus is over 100 acres. So there is a good bit of land outside of the forest that we own and manage as well. And I do work on those other auxiliary properties as well. So the trees are one of the most unique features of the forest. We have 64 native tree species. We have cored and dated trees in excess of 300 years old. So this is not speculation. This is actually taking core samples and counting the rings. So this is a science called Dendrochronology. So looking at the ages of trees. And you can do this by taking a little sliver of wood out of the trunk of the tree and then it sequesters that wound and seals it up, so it does not do permanent lethal damage to the tree. So we know we have tulip trees over 300 years old. There's probably some oaks over 300 years old as well. I recently found the first tree over 160 feet tall in Fernbank Forest as well, which is exceptional. There's only 3 other sites in Atlanta that have trees over 160 feet tall. Beecher Hills, which is a wonderful green space if you have not been there. Trees Atlanta does work there. Bitsy Grant Tennis Center, so North Side Drive, Bobby Jones Golf Course area. There's a little sliver of a forest in the southwest corner, and there's a super tall tulip tree there. And then on Emory's campus, there's at least 1 tulip tree over 160 feet. So that's kind of the threshold for tall trees in Atlanta. And this Rucker Index, what that means is that's an average of your top 10 tallest species on a site. So this is a way to compare one site to another. And from all the data I've collected across Metro Atlanta, Fernbank currently has the highest Rucker Index. So if we take our top 10 tallest trees, that averages 138.5 feet, which is really exceptional for any city east of the Rocky Mountains. So I also dabble in champion trees. I measure champion trees, I search for them, I nominate them on a city level through a program with Trees Atlanta, state level through Georgia Forestry Commission, and the national level through American Forests. I'm not going to dive too deep into that. That's kind of a separate presentation, but champion trees are the largest of their species in a given area, and we do have a number of the city champions located in Fernbank Forest. And in addition to trees, we've got a couple of other interesting things. So on the far left here, that twisting vine is a bay star vine, which is a native vine, native to the Piedmont, and it also goes into the coastal plain. It's a deciduous vine. It's a state threatened plant species. Only about 15 locations are recognized across the state. We have numerous populations, distinct populations that are separate from each other on Fernbank property. That tells us something. That tells us that there are the right conditions, there's rich soil, there's diversity, there's some cooler protected areas. Starvine is pretty picky about where it grows, so we're lucky to have that, and that's one of the things I'm trying to protect. We also have Oconee bells, which are even more rare than starvine. These were planted. We have record of these being planted. They were saved from an area that was flooded for a reservoir in South Carolina in the 1970s. And it's really cool that we have probably 50 to 100 individual plants that are thriving that we have record of being planted about 45 years ago. So while they're not truly endemic to the forest, they have found a safe haven in the forest. Same thing probably with the pale yellow trillium here at the bottom center. This is one of the native trilliums to Georgia. I think there's a few dozen native to Georgia. Probably not native to Fernbank Forest. It has a really narrow range near the Savannah River, but I really don't know for sure how it got in the forest. And it's one little clump of 3 plants. That's it. So it's endemic to the state. It's rare. It's something that we want to protect, and it's unusual. We don't have any other besides these 3 in the forest. And then on the far right, we've got one of the most charismatic and just really neat species in the forest, animal species. This is a spring salamander, and we partner with Amphibian Foundation to do amphibian research and surveys in the forest. And spring salamander is kind of really just about the best thing that you could find inside the city. So they are picky about their habitat. They are typically not found in near cities and urban areas. They like clean water conditions, and they live near springs, which we do have natural springs in the forest. We have seen a few spring salamanders, not a lot, but 2 or 3 over the years. And I believe I believe we're the only site or one of only 1 or 2 sites inside the I-285 perimeter that has spring salamanders. So Peter alluded to kind of the issue of what our main task was, what we were dealing with, going back to before his photo project started, and that is non-native invasive species, plants in particular. There are invasive animals across the world as well, and in Fernbank Forest. Primarily our issue, however, is invasive plants. So I kind of put some of the top 5 worst of the worst here: English ivy, Mahonia, Ryope or monkey grass, Eleagnus, and Chinese wisteria. In 2012, before I stepped in this role, when we took over management of the forest, the very first thing that was done was an ecological survey by an ecologist from Rutgers. So we vetted numerous people and decided on one professor and researcher in New Jersey who came down, did a survey in the forest over multiple visits, and one of the main takeaways that we got from him was the forest is green, it's lush, and it's dying. This is a winter shot of the forest. Could be late fall, but you can see the leaves are off of the trees, and everything that's green in this picture really should not be here. This is a host of non-native invasive species that came over with colonists for various reasons. There is chocolate vine here, also known as Akebia. There is Chinese wisteria, there's English ivy, there is Japanese honeysuckle, bamboo. So it was a mess. It was some areas where there were only 2 or 3 or 4 invasive plants, a couple of native trees, and really nothing else. Whereas you should have dozens, if not hundreds, of native plants in a given acre in the forest. So that kind of leads to this next slide. We were starting to see decreased biodiversity, and this is not a problem unique to Fernbank Forest. This is something that green spaces across the globe are suffering from. So when you have English ivy take over a space, it tends to dominate and outcompete a lot of the native species, and over time you might just start kind of having a situation where you only have English ivy, or that's one of the main species. So there's kind of a ripple effect. If you are an animal that lives in the forest and you don't feed on English ivy, or you don't nest in English ivy, then you're not going to have the kind of habitat that you need. If you're a tree in the forest and you start to get engulfed with English ivy, those vines will grow and grow and grow. I've seen some vines that are 4 or 5 inches diameter, very heavy on the trees. They can cause the trees to fall. They produce seeds when they get to the top of the trees. So there can be a cascade of negative effects when you let these species sort of run amok in the forest. So what was our plan? How are we going to deal with this, with all of these invasive plants and ultimately the decreased biodiversity? So the first thing I really tried to impress on our board, our staff, our funders, everyone involved, all the stakeholders, the neighbors, was that our end goal is a healthy, diverse forest. So our end goal is not no English ivy. And those are distinctly different. If our end goal was no English ivy, we could just come in and hire someone to rip all of it out in a couple weeks or a couple months. But what would happen from an erosion standpoint? What would happen from a biodiversity, from a habitat standpoint? Things probably wouldn't be so good if we took all the ivy out in a couple weeks or a couple months. So the goal that we were aiming towards is to have a healthy, diverse forest. So the means to get there is going to determine whether we can kind of end up or start trending towards a healthy forest. So the first thing we need to know is, what do we have? So we took an inventory. Like I mentioned, we had a ecologist from Rutgers do an inventory. We got together biodiversity lists of the good, the bad, the ugly, everything. Let's know what we have and where it is, map the forest. And one of the most important things that I did, and I always tell this to any other land manager who consults with me, set up photo points. You want to be able to visually track the progress and the process of any big project like this. So set up photo points, even if it's just 5 photo points. I think we probably have about 50 photo points now, but even if it's just 5, do those 5 photo points well. Take a picture in the growing season and in the dormant season at a minimum, and repeat that annually. You know, I have to set up calendar reminders so I remember to do it, because time just kind of slides by, but those photos are immensely helpful. So looking at the good in the forest, lots of native biodiversity. Over the last century, actually over 200 birds have been documented in the forest. There is a history of Audubon Society and other birding groups coming into the forest for a very, very long time and taking really good records of what they've observed in the forest. We have, you can see here, lots of amphibians, reptiles. Peter alluded to the wildflowers and native herbs, and we have about a dozen native fern species as well. NNIS, again, stands for non-native invasive species. This number is unfortunately probably higher than 66 now. I think it's about 70. And these are categories that were set up by the Georgia Exotic Pest Plant Council. So the higher, or excuse me, the lower the number, category 1 would be the worst species, meaning probably the most aggressive. It maybe produces a lot of seeds, they're easily spread, that sort of thing. So those are of higher concern. Category 4 would be lower concern. So I mentioned photo points. Another thing, as far as documentation, I have been tracking the wildflower bloom time, so the wildflower phenology in the forest, going on, let's see, 2022 will be the 7th spring. And it's really insightful because we have data from a study from Fernbank Science Center from the 1970s that shows, that documented the bloom time over about a 5-year period of a few dozen native wildflowers. So what that means is I have data from the same exact green space. I can track it now, 45 years later, and compare apples to apples. And the trends that I'm seeing already is that on average, our native wildflowers are blooming 2 to 3 weeks earlier than they were 45 years ago, which I think would make a wonderful study. There's climate change implications and things like that. But right now we're just kind of in the data collection phase of that project. We also document any new organism discoveries. And I utilize iNaturalist all the time. If you're not familiar with it, highly recommend get that free app on your phone. Even if you're just a novice and you want to know what things are and you aren't able to identify them on your own, iNaturalist can help you. There's a community of people out there ready to help you identify what's in your backyard or local park. So early in the restoration process, I decided I have a good idea of what I don't know, of what my limitations are, and I wanted to consult with other land managers, look into the literature, the research methods for invasive plant removal, kind of do my own personal background research before diving in too heavy. And then I was able to prioritize work areas. So going back to meeting with land managers, I met with Brian Williams, the restoration director at Trees Atlanta. He's been doing that for a number of years and we used to work together. So I really value his insight, experience, and his professional opinion. I met with park managers. I met with nonprofit land managers, lots of different folks around the Atlanta area. And I also looked into the research, the literature, and found that there is not much in the literature on, English ivy removal and what comes back when you remove it by hand, or what's the best way to remove it. There's lots of anecdotes and people can tell you about it from their experience, but there's not a lot of research. So when we decided to start the work, we really needed to prioritize. 65 acres is not that big, but it's pretty big when you consider that probably 50 of the 65 acres were covered in English ivy. So what's the priority? Where are we going to start? And I decided that this north-facing slope that Peter alluded to is really kind of the crown jewel, the most exciting and ecologically diverse feature of the forest. So this is probably about 5 to 7 acres. It's north to northeast facing, probably about an 80-foot difference in topography between the high point and the low point. Lots of big old trees, topsoil 6 to 12 inches, maybe even deeper than 12 inches. A very disturbed herb layer, but the trees were very intact. Lots of cool salamanders in here, birds, lots of different things like that. This is also an area where we do a lot of programming. It's easily accessible. It's close to the pond, close to a couple of the main paths. So this easily jumped out as, this is priority number 1. So in addition to that, I kind of wanted to prioritize other areas and other features of the forest. So working on trailside areas, hugely important, because a lot of times weeds or invasive plants are spread by humans or by any organism that might be walking on a path. So if we can create a buffer on the paths, we went about 10 to 20 feet deep of removing not just English ivy, but any invasive plants in those areas, then that can kind of hopefully buy us some time and give us a little buffer, and visually, aesthetically, it looks better too. So trailside areas were a priority. Removing woody invasives, vines on trees, so saving the trees that we can still save. The fern bank, which is the slope I just mentioned. Any areas that have rare species, areas where we do programming, that sort of thing. So probably way too many priorities here. I don't know that you should have 7 priorities at the same time, but I really pushed our volunteers and contractors and staff to multitask and work in a lot of different areas at once. So on to the actual ecological restoration. This is a shot of the Fernbank slope kind of midway through English ivy removal. So this is probably 2017, maybe, something like that. So it looks like a mosaic of green and brown. We'll talk a little more about that. So I absolutely have to mention all of our partners. Without our, I call them partners. These are staff, volunteers, but really the bulk of the work has been done by contractors. So these are professionals that have experience in this field that we have hired to do this work. It's tedious work. It is work that has to be done with extreme care. It's work that I need to know that I can trust the people doing the work and that they have the best interest of the forest and the ecosystem in mind. And Trees Atlanta has been one of the main partners. You can see some of our other partners here, and we continue to add to that list of partners as well. So Deep Forest Field School did a lot of the manual removal and saved a lot of the trees. So you can see a before and after picture here. That is the same site, and there's only 1 day difference between the top and bottom picture. It's just absolutely stunning. Mostly wisteria, Chinese wisteria, also a little bit of English ivy. So really saving those trees, that was high priority. And then what's probably the most tedious work in the forest is teasing out this English ivy, which is a solid, you can see upper left corner here, just a solid green blanket of English ivy. It was everywhere. So not too bad on the trees here, but all over the ground. We didn't, once again, we didn't want to rip it all out at once. This is a steep slope. It's up to probably 40-degree slope down here at the bottom near the pond. So we wanted to tease it out carefully, save the trees, kind of pull around the trees, create a buffer, and then this, what we call the cookie cutter method. So there's little holes around the trees where we pulled out the ivy, and then these horizontal lines where we were able to connect one tree to another. And we actually used some of the English ivy, uprooted it, rolled it downhill, used it to collect leaf litter, decrease erosion. And if we did a good job uprooting it, it would not reroot itself into the ground. Trees Atlanta played a heavy role in the woody invasive removal. So with, go back here for a second, with ground cover removal and herbaceous removal, really about 90, I'd say about 90, maybe 95% of the invasive removal we do is by hand or with tools, usually small tools, without herbicide. One exception is large woody invasives that we cannot successfully dig out without creating a huge amount of soil disturbance. We will do some selective cut and treat in the forest. So that is kind of if we can't get any other method to work, but it's a means to an end, and we try to do that extremely carefully. So how would you do that kind of work carefully? Well, this is where I had to do some of my own research and kind of look into what chemicals are used and what kind of adjuvants or surfactants are added to those chemicals and what effect might those have on native wildlife. So for instance, with Roundup, the active ingredient is glyphosate. Rodeo, the active ingredient is glyphosate. Roundup has other surfactants in it that rodeo does not have. So you can see there's a major difference between, this is LD is a lethal dose required for given species. So there's research done on all sorts of different chemicals to determine that. So this is a tiny, tiny number for Roundup. What that means is a very, very small amount of Roundup can be potentially harmful if it's in direct contact with certain animals. That number increases dramatically with rodeo. And yet it's the same active ingredient that's controlling the invasive plants. So the tricky thing is the surfactants aren't often regulated. So you have to do your own research because they are not required to put that on the label. So not all herbicides are created equal. And we also do very limited foliar application, mostly for Chinese wisteria in areas where it's a complete monoculture. So there's no risk of overspray on desirable species. And a huge group that does tremendous work for us in the forest is our volunteers. We have volunteers the second Saturday of every month, and occasionally we have them on other days as well. But there's an open invitation. Anybody who wants to volunteer can join us. This area highlighted in the northwest corner of the forest, that's a solid about 3 to 3.5 acres that was entirely managed by volunteers. So I tend to put volunteers in areas that don't have a whole lot of diversity of native things we're trying to protect, just out of an abundance of caution, especially if it's a large corporate group or something like that. But we do have some really well-trained and what I consider expert volunteers that come weekly, and I can put on some more precision jobs in the forest. So some before and after shots here. This is exclusively volunteer managed areas. So no contractor work really, or very, very little. And I mentioned corporate groups. A lot of corporations and even sororities, fraternities, lots of groups have a service element. They want to come out and give back to the community, especially through nonprofit or green space. So we try to utilize those groups as much as we can. And we have a staff, a small, very small but mighty staff of interpretive rangers. This is Ranger Chris here. He's been with Fernbank longer than any other ranger, over 5 years now. And that is a mountain of English ivy and Japanese honeysuckle that the rangers removed over the course of a week. And occasionally we'll have students or service learning groups as well. And we tend to have a good time out in the forest. So on to some of the results. So this picture here in the center of the screen, this is a plot where English ivy was removed. And at a glance, there's little pops of green. Can't really tell what it is until you get up closer. These are all little baby tulip poplar seedlings. Those were not seeded in by hand. This is the forest doing what it wants to do. This is Mother Nature taking over. We don't really do any seeding. We do very, very little replanting in any areas. Pretty much we're relying on the seed bank and the native species there to fill in. So this was an average year. This is from a few years ago, pre-COVID era. And you can see how the breakdown of hours are as far as who's doing the ecological restoration work in the forest. So very, very heavy on our contractors, almost 75% on our contractors, then probably about 12% staff, 12% volunteers. And we just hit about 80,000 cubic feet of invasive plant material, biomass that's been removed from the forest. So this is my very modest 929 square foot bungalow in Kirkwood. Did some math. 80,000 cubic feet, that doesn't really mean anything to me if I don't have anything to compare it to. Well, that's about filling my house up, every room, floor to ceiling, 10 times. So that really kind of puts it in perspective. What does 80,000 cubic feet of English ivy look like? That's a lot. And 11,000 hours of people power to do this. 11,000 hours over 5.5 years. Just absolutely stunning. So in addition to the on-the-ground sort of hard work of the physical work of pulling out these invasive species, we also decided to set up some research plots. Let's see what comes back in the forest whenever we remove English ivy by hand. So with the help of Kennesaw State University, Professor Matt Weand, and a couple of students, the lead on that was Colin Anderson, we were able to set up 27 research plots with three different treatments. So we have control plots where we left the English ivy. We have plots where the ivy was removed just prior to the study. And then we have plots where the ivy was removed upon the start of the study. And you can already see some trends here just after 3 years of data, 2018, 2019, 2020. So the bar graphs here, the taller ones on the right are plots where the ivy was removed. And this is an index of the diversity, biodiversity. So how many different plant species specifically. So we didn't look at animal species, just plants. And you can see a trend already. And this is what we would expect to see, but we want the science to be able to back it up. If we remove English ivy by hand, will the native species return? Will there be more diversity? Seems like there would be, but we want to be able to know that. We want to be able to quantify that, and we want to be able to share this research with other land managers. And on to my favorite part, the pictures. So we've got some before and after shots. This is Elephant Rock, and the before shot is it's just completely choked with Mahonia and Japanese honeysuckle and a few different things. And you can see there's still some green in the shot on the right, lower right, but we don't have that thick, giant layer of invasive shrubs. And those were all producing seeds too, so they were high priority for removal. This is a stunning area. I promise this is the same spot here. You can kind of line up some of the trees in the middle to see those two tulips in the middle on the top are also the same two tulips in the middle on the bottom. This was an area choked with mimosa and chocolate vine and wisteria. And once we took it out, there really wasn't much left aside from some of the canopy trees around the perimeter. So this has been an area that we've had to continually work on. This is an old cistern that dates back to the Harrison family that lived in the forest in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So you can see, take away the English ivy and Chinese wisteria, or at least most of it, and you never know what you're going to find. Another area choked with English ivy that we are really starting to free up here. This is a shot, the downstream area from Elephant Rock. So this is kind of the far eastern end of the forest, or excuse me, western end of the forest. And again, at ground level, a lot of disturbance, really, you know, a lot of invasive, well, not a lot, but a few invasives that are taking over a huge area. And once we removed those, there were a few herbaceous things there, some desirable native things, but they just needed some room to grow. They needed a chance to thrive. So these pictures are a couple years apart, and we are starting to see a really nice herb layer and ferns and wildflowers and things come back in to this area. This is just about a monoculture of liriope or monkey grass. This was not planted. This is an old wagon road that went through the forest. And obviously the monkey grass liked the disturbance. So same exact area, progress shot here. This was all dug by hand with volunteer and intern help. A lot of our interns came from Paideia. Definitely got to give a shout out to those volunteers. They have a service learning program in January and May every year. And most of the students came out in the dead of winter in January and dug liriope for most of the month. And they did an amazing job. This is really a legacy project that I like to show off. This is an area Trees Atlanta tackled. Some of you probably know Tabitha at Trees Atlanta. She helped immensely with this project when she was working with the crew. It was the only area that we had bamboo, and we had a lot of it, and it was tall. It was 30 feet tall in some areas. We took it out, not much left. So this is an area that we did choose to plant some trees. Trees Atlanta helped with that. And we actually had our board members come out and get their hands dirty and plant 24 trees, including a couple of native pine trees. So those are the ones you see in the photo at the bottom. We also, as sort of an experiment, decided to put in some native grasses here since it was so open and sunny and we needed something to fill the space. So we did, this is the only area in the forest where we did seed in some plants. And we put in a couple of species of native grasses with the help of Walter Bland, who some of you may know from his restoration work really around the state. Here's a progress shot of the Fernbank slope. So at the bottom looking uphill. The top photo shows kind of midway through removing the ivy. The bottom photo shows where I'd say 98, 99% of the ivy is gone. So this is a winter shot of the forest now. It's really open. You can see the beech tree leaves hanging on. You can see probably a half mile across the forest in some areas. It's just spectacular. Those views were not available 5 years ago. This is an old house that is still standing in the forest, a 1914 structure. And, you know, invasive plants love areas with disturbance, areas where there's been a lot of humans and activity and cars and trails and things like that. So, of course, around the house, there's a lot of these aggressive invasive species that we needed to deal with. This is an area where it kind of demonstrates perfectly why this is a forever project. So we cleaned the wisteria out of the trees, we cleaned the Chinese privet, and then look what flourished at ground level. You can see a couple of the little purple flowers. This is Vinca major, also known as periwinkle. So it wasn't a quick transition, take out the bad stuff and then all of a sudden, you know, trillium pops up everywhere. No, what happened was another invasive took root. It liked this gap that we opened up. So one of the things I share with land managers and anybody doing this kind of work is this is a forever project. And I attended, I listened to, it was actually an Instagram live recently, and the guy who was presenting said, you know, when it comes to a lot of this land management stuff, you can have it now or you can have it forever, but you can't have both. And it just hit me like a ton of bricks. And I think what he's saying is, you know, you can rip all the English ivy out. You can make it look good now. You can take out all the vinca. You can make it look good right now in this moment, this snapshot in time, or you can chip away at it forever. You can manage the land. You can work with the land, listen to the land, learn from the native people that worked in these areas, learn from the science, and you can work at it forever. But you can't do both. So this is not about cleaning up the forest, making it look pretty. This is playing the long game. So yeah, and there I mentioned on this slide, you can have it now or you can have it forever, but you can't have both. And of course, one of the things that I'm excited about that the forest does is the ecosystem services that it provides. It cleans water for Atlantans. It slows down water. All of the water, rainwater coming through that watershed slows down by the tree branches, the soil. The creek is never really flashy in the forest. It will raise, you know, a few inches, maybe a couple feet in a really bad storm, but it's very buffered by this ecosystem that's there. So, you know, it's also all these services most of you guys know about. It's cleaning the air. It's providing a haven for people for recreational purposes. It helps with our mental health, being able to spend time in the forest bathing. It's a place to slow down and just kind of saunter and enjoy the woods. So there's numerous, you know, ecosystem services and direct services that it provides, and indirect services as well. And this is not unique to Fernbank. We've got a lot of green space that we need to work hard to protect in Atlanta because it also happens to be very valuable real estate. But these areas are providing services to people that live adjacent to them and people that live across town. Okay, I'm gonna skip over that. And I think that covers the bulk of my presentation. So I'm going to stop. That was a lot of talking. So I apologize. It's a little lengthy, but I want to be able to take some questions. And please think about questions for Peter and for myself. I'm so lucky. We were so lucky to have Peter be able to come out and devote 1.5 years of his life to this forest. He spent more time in the forest in that 1.5 years than I did during that span, probably. And also thankful to Trees Atlanta. Thank you for inviting me to talk about this, and thank you for being a partner in this process, because I can't do it alone, that's for sure.
Thank you both for your presentations. Definitely very amazing photos from Peter. I really enjoyed the winter ones. It's definitely a different view when in a different season. Mm-hmm. And thank you, Eli, as well. Eli, I think you saw that question from the Q&A where Alex is asking whether the eastern red hemlock spring around, if they were introduced or if they were there before.
That's a good observation and good question, Alex. I suspect they were planted. The thing about Fernbank Forest is it has been a destination for people in Atlanta for a long time. It was kind of a tourist destination even before Fernbank started managing it in 1939. And what that meant was at that time, people could kind of come and go as they wanted. And I think people planted things and they also dug up things and took things home. And the family that lived, the last family that lived there certainly planted things. Hemlocks are not truly native to Atlanta. They're native a few counties north and all the way up to Canada. So I think they were planted along with some of the other unique things like the plum leaf azalea, which is stunning right now. It's probably the latest blooming native azalea in Georgia. So we are unique. I don't like to say that Fernbank is pristine or untouched. because it's just simply not true. We don't have any areas like that. But there are unique things that were planted, and they certainly provide value, and they don't do harm. So we leave the hemlocks there.
Yeah. We also have a question from Emily. What brought Peter to FERNBANK for his project? She mentioned she missed the few first minutes of the presentation. So what brought Peter to FERNBANK, and what kind of unique challenges did FERNBANK present to him in his art and art making process?
Mhm. Well, it started with a commission from FERNBANK, and it was also supported by a gentleman, Bob Yellowlees, who had a gallery in Atlanta called Lumiere Gallery, and he was familiar with the restoration that was going on. So I had got a commission that allowed me to spend time there. When I first went there, it was a little challenging. It was during the late summertime, which in some ways is not the best, the best lighting, and it's very hot, and it's a lot of the trees are very full, as you don't see. And there's also, in 2015, there was all the invasive species. So at first I was a little bit nervous about how to what was the potential, I guess, the visual potential. But the more time I spent, and like Michelle said, the seasons in the winter is really special. I felt the lighting is really beautiful, and it has a stark beauty to it. And then when you start getting into springtime, you get all the leaf out and the wildflowers aspect. So I think the other thing that really brought a new dimension to me was when I started taking some pictures with the drone. At first, you could sort of fly over the canopy and look at it down, and then eventually I started doing some where sort of part way up, and you could sort of see different views. So that kind of brought a whole nother visual element to the project.
That's great. Yeah. So a question for you, Eli. Is there any concern about the woolly allergy in the hemlocks?
Definitely concern. It's something I keep an eye on. Our hemlocks have not, knock on wood, have not been infested with any woolly delgids to date. I do have some partners, some private companies that have offered to help us treat them if and when we see an infestation. So we're keeping an eye on them. But that brings up another invasive insect that has been devastating across Atlanta, the emerald ash borer, and we just got done retreating. We've got about 65 ash trees that are 5-inch diameter or bigger, so about 1 per acre. Not a lot, but still some really nice specimens. And I'm happy to say that Trees Atlanta partnered with us, and they had the resources and tools to be able to retreat those. So we treated them 3 years ago with the help of ArborGuard, and we just retreated them, literally just finished this week retreating them. And I'm happy to say that we've only had about 10% loss of ash trees. Whereas if you go to a lot of green spaces around Atlanta, there might not be 10% living now. So emerald ash borer is out there. It's everywhere. If you have ash trees you want to protect, you can still do that. And Trees Atlanta has resources, and most local arborists do too. But that's really the new guy on the block, the emerald ash borer. Bad news.
That's right. And Peter, do you have any art project coming up soon?
Well, I worked for quite a while. I did a drone series about construction sites around Atlanta, and And then recently I've been doing a project of urban trees at night. I actually have a exhibit at Spalding Nicks coming up for the Atlanta Celebrates Photography late September and October about those projects. So that's the latest things I've been working on.
That's great. We lost Eli for a minute. All right, Eli. Hey, so I don't see any more questions for the attendees. But thank you so much for both of you for attending this presentation, showing us about your book and about the restoration effort at Fernbank. Definitely enjoyed it. And I'm sure our attendees have enjoyed it as well. Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. If you have any questions, please feel free to send us to the education@treesatlanta.org email. And we'll be following up with the recording of the video and some resources. Thank you, everybody, and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you,
All right.
Michelle. Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.